Okay, so we all need to be aware, I think, of our limitations and our weaknesses, our flaws. I try and be aware of mine. And one of them is that I am a bit long-winded and bloviating perhaps at times. I'm sorry. And so there were a couple of things that I wanted to talk about, and I was aware that the video would go to sort of 40, 50, 60 minutes, the main video. So I wanted to create a second video just to discuss these two issues of testosterone and the claim that testosterone doesn't play any role. It's a myth that testosterone has anything to do with male performance advantage. And then to discuss fairness and meaningfulness, which are terms which are bandied around a lot, and I think wrongly, on both sides of this sort of transport debate. So I wanted to give my take on it. Right, and it's largely a philosophical thing, and I'm not saying I'm right and everybody else is wrong. I'm giving you can work that out for yourself where you think which is the most reasonable and rational way of applying these terms. But I'm telling you what I think about it. Maybe start some debate on that. Let's deal with the testosterone first, because I've heard this argument a number of times. Most recently on the Essence of Thought channel. And the Essence of Thought channel, apparently that's the name of the channel, and it's not an individual, so I'm trying to get all that right. But it was Ethel, the usual protagonist on that channel, making this argument that I've heard her make before, which is that the idea of expecting trans women to lower their testosterone level to compete with biological females in a women's category is unfair. And I say biological females because this also would apply to cis women like Caster Semenya. Bear in mind that being a cis woman doesn't mean that you're biologically female. It means that you are assigned female at birth. This is why I always use the term biological female, because cis woman is misleading. Because when you're talking about your biological sex rather than your presumed biological sex, that's important, and it is in cases like Caster Semenya, where she was obviously presumed to be biologically female, but actually is 46XY and has testes rather than ovaries that produce male levels of testosterone that her body is responsive to. So in a sporting sense, in a technical sense, she's male because she's got testes, produces sperm rather than ova. And in a sporting sense, you could say, well, she certainly isn't female in a sporting sense, right? So it's important to use biological female, I think, rather than cis. That's why. It's not because I'm trying to make some sort of political anti-trans statement or something. So the claim is that testosterone doesn't do anything or does very little, and that you cannot account for the performance gap through testosterone. And Essence of Thought, Ethel's conclusion from that seems to be, so it's unfair to set these recommendations or these requirements to lower your testosterone. The problem with that logic is, let me read from the recent report, because this says something here. Importantly, this is under a section debate over the role of testosterone, where it's discussing some researchers who have questioned whether testosterone plays a role. Specifically in this case, circulating testosterone, not necessarily historical testosterone, because there are some claims that have been made, including by some of the Soviet bloc researchers, East German researchers back in the day, that once you give somebody elevated testosterone for a period of time, there comes a kind of point of no return where when you take the testosterone away, some of those advantages remain. So it's testosterone related, but not in the moment. There's the testosterone that you have, the serum testosterone that's flowing around your body now, but there's also the history, the years, perhaps decades of having typically male levels of testosterone in your body. But anyway, these authors have suggested that actually the idea that testosterone's responsible for it all is wrong. And this is a comment that the authors wrote. Importantly, the corollary of circulating testosterone levels not being fully responsible for this difference is that there must be another, yet undefined factor which must account for the remaining differences following testosterone suppression. The retained advantage may mean that previous testosterone exposure is responsible for long-term effects, or there is another explanation, perhaps referable to genetic differences, which has not yet been identified. So this is the bits that I don't understand about this argument when people like the Essence of Thought channel make it, is that they seem to be saying, well, we don't think testosterone is responsible for the difference, ergo, it's not acceptable to expect trans women to lower their testosterone. The problem is, if that isn't responsible for it, it's almost like they're saying, so that means it's okay. There isn't a difference. But there is a difference. It's kind of worse. You're presenting the worst case scenario. What you're saying is, well, if testosterone isn't responsible, even if they reduce their testosterone, they still shouldn't be competing in that category because the differences still remain. Right. It's almost like they're arguing against themselves. The difference is there. The physiological differences between males and females, adult males and females, is there. If it's testosterone, if it's all the testosterone that's in your system, that's responsible for all of it, then that's great. We can probably deal with that. If it isn't, if it's historical testosterone you had maybe in your teen years, that made you grow taller, that had your bones set, that maybe increased your muscular development, that never fully atrophies back to typically female levels, even if you reduce the testosterone down to female levels for 5 years, 10 years, perhaps, right? You've still got to account for it. And what you're doing is, what you're saying is there's no way, if it isn't testosterone reduction, there's probably nothing that we can do. So then it's just tough, isn't it? You're arguing against yourself there. And that's what I don't understand. It's like the argument's left hanging. It's like, we've got you now. It's not testosterone, so that means it's okay. It's ridiculous. It's like me suggesting that people my age have a sporting advantage over 80-year-olds. And then I go on to say, well, the advantage, I think, is because 80-year-olds have a bus pass. And when you've got a bus pass, you don't do as much walking, so you get less fit. And then Essence of Thought comes along and debunks that it's not the bus pass thing, that the degradation happens even amongst 80-year-olds that haven't got a bus pass, and that it happens before people get a bus pass because they get a bus pass at 65. It's already begun. So they've debunked the bus pass bit, but the difference still remains, doesn't it? It doesn't show that my level and an 80-year-old's level is the same. You've made it even worse. What you've said is we can't just remove the bus pass and level the playing field anymore because there's something deeper that maybe is not so easy to deal with. So that's that one. The second one is an interesting one, really interesting. And I was reading this article. I've got it here. It's a piece by Joanna Harper. I quite like Joanna Harper. I think she's good. I don't know if you can see that. It's just too bright. And Joanna Harper is someone who's long talked about meaningfulness, meaningful categories and meaningful competition. And I fundamentally disagree with the way that Joanna Harper frames meaningfulness in sport. Similarly, I also disagree with the way that people label fairness in sport and things being unfair. So maybe I should tell you the disagreements first. So in terms of meaningfulness, what Joanna Harper suggests is that meaningful competition is competition where people are at sort of the same level of ability. And as people's levels of ability coalesce and get closer, that makes the competition more meaningful. If they're further apart, it's less meaningful. And that appears to be the only axis upon which meaningfulness exists. I disagree with that. I'll explain why in a minute. And then in terms of fairness, people, including the people who are maybe on the side that I usually am, that have more concerns about trans women competing in female sport, frame fairness in a way that I utterly disagree with. They say things like it's unfair for a man to compete with a woman. And it's, just the same as it would be unfair for an adult to compete with a juvenile. Again, I totally think that is wrong. So let me explain why I think those two things are wrong. Let me give you some examples and then I'll suggest the way that I think it actually is and how it works. So in terms of fairness, if you look at somebody like, for example, there have been some female golfers, professional golfers, who have decided to try their hand in the men's PGA, Professional Golfers Association Tour. playing in the men's tournaments. They've decided to do that. They've had a go. They tried to give it a go. Was that unfair? And if it was unfair, what does that mean? That the men should have, played one-handed or done something differently to make it fair? Or that however good those women were, we shouldn't have allowed them to even try to play in the men's PGA because it's not fair on them to be given the opportunity to try. Do you see what I mean? When we label that as unfair, it's intrinsically unfair for women to compete with men, we create problems. The same with age. I've heard it said that it's unfair for a juvenile to play with an adult, to compete with an adult. What about Sachin Tendulkar, one of the greatest batsmen that have ever lived? The Indian batsman who started playing Test cricket at the age of 16. It shows how old I am. I remember that. I remember him starting. He's 48 now. He's retired. Remember him starting. Was that unfair? Right. He was good enough to play Test cricket. So where's the unfairness there? Should he have been stopped? Should somebody have said, Sachin, you're good enough to play Test cricket, but it's just not fair on you. That you play against these adults, or the adults will have to bowl underarm rather than overarm against you because it's not fair because they're adults. You see what I mean? This isn't helping. This clearly is not where fairness fits into it. Okay. My view on fairness, and I'll come back to this in a minute, is that fairness kicks in once you start setting rules within a sport and once you start setting categorizations. So there are no qualities that a human possesses that are intrinsically unfair. It becomes unfair when within that categorization you have those qualities. And then with meaningfulness, I dispute the fact that a category becomes meaningful because the level of competition is close. We want the level of competition to be close. That's good. It provides for a good encounter. But I don't think that's what makes the categorization meaningful. After all, imagine this scenario. I've got two runners, distance runners. They're both in their early 60s and they compete against each other. One of them is significantly better than the other, and they have a race, and the one that's significantly better than the other wins quite convincingly. I still get meaning from that. I can look at those two runners and I get some meaning from that. This person is better than that. And it means something to me because I feel like I'm making an apples versus apples comparison. I'm comparing two people, two men, let's say, two males, both over 60, and I can see this one's better than this one is significantly better than this one. And that seems meaningful to me. Imagine now that we look at the statistics of performance and then we see that a typical elite 15-and-a-half-year-old is about as good as a typical elite 61 or 62-year-old. So we decide to allow under 16s to compete in the over 60s category. By Joanna Harper's way of reckoning, this is meaningful because they're of similar level. But it doesn't seem very meaningful to me. When one of them wins or the other one wins, I don't really know what I'm seeing, what I'm to get from that. A 15-and-a-half-year-old's beating a 62-year-old, that seems significantly less meaningful than a 62-year-old beating another 62-year-old, even if the results were closer, because it feels like an apples versus oranges comparison. And I think this is the way that we actually look at meaningfulness. There may be an aspect of closeness that when competitors are of similar performance level, we feel it's more meaningful. But I propose that the biggest impact on meaningfulness is that we're having what we feel is an apples versus apples comparison. That the two people that we're looking at, or the field of people that we're looking at, have some intrinsic property that we feel it's an intrinsic property, at least, that they all have in common, that they're not just all of the same level, right? It's not just random people from society who all run the 100 metres in roughly the same time. That doesn't seem meaningful to us. You've got a sort of unfit adult male, and you've got a fit adult female, and then you've got an elite level 11-year-old and all this stuff. They might all be at the same level, but it just doesn't seem meaningful in any way, shape or form. So I propose this is how it works to sort of put together meaningfulness and fairness. This is how I view it, which is that where meaningfulness kicks in is in creating those categories. Let's start off with a situation where there are no bandings whatsoever. Okay, just one. Everybody of every age, every size, male, female, everybody just competes together. Okay. And if we want to create more sporting opportunities, which is usually what we want to do, that's usually why we're doing it, give people more chances within sport to compete. What we want to do is give them a chance to compete against similar people. And I think that that's where meaningfulness kicks in. And this is why we set the categories we do. We set an over 40s category because it's people over 40 versus other people who are over 40. It's not just that they're at the same level. It's that they all possess this same quality of being over 40 or under 18. That is what we do. And that's a fundamental aspect of it. When we create male and female categorizations, it's not just that they're all going to be of the same level, because they won't be. It's that we feel like we're comparing apples with apples, not apples with oranges. At that point, until we've done that, fairness doesn't reckon into it at all. There is nothing intrinsically unfair with being male. There's nothing intrinsically unfair with being 25. There's nothing intrinsically unfair with being 120 kilos. It's only once we create those categories that situationally those things become unfair, and usually in an asymmetric way. So being 25 isn't unfair in sport, but being 25 and competing against a 42-year-old in a category for over 40s would be unfair. It wouldn't be unfair competing against a 42-year-old in the age open category, right? The same with, you could say with sex, the same with weight. If you're 120 kilos and you're competing against somebody who's 70 kilos, well, if it's in an under 75 kilos category, that's pretty unfair. But if that 70-year-old has decided to have a go in this weight open category that you compete in, you're not doing anything unfair there. There's nothing unfair. In terms of that category, you can be any weight. So weight isn't an issue where fairness is involved at that point. So that's how I see it. Meaningfulness is largely the criterion by which we create these categories. And we do it because we want to give more people opportunity. So we want to create categories, and we want to create not just random categories where everybody's at the same level. We want to create categories that feel meaningful to us. And then once we've created those categories, we obviously have requirements for those categories. And once we have requirements for those categories, that is the point upon which fairness kicks in. Not before then. That's when these certain personal characteristics can start to become unfair. They're not intrinsically unfair. They are situationally unfair, contingent upon the category involved. Okay, that's it. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you enjoyed the main video if you watched that. Interested to know your thoughts.